Hello, and welcome back to Safe Space. I'm your host, Chris Edwards, and this is the show dedicated to people of color in the LGBTQIA plus community. This week, I'm bringing back a very special guest. He was here a couple episodes ago, Mr. DeAndre Gordon. Sir, welcome back to the show. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm happy to be back. Thank you for having me, Chris.
Oh, this is awesome. I'm so glad you asked me to come back and you want to share a little bit more and explore a little bit more on the topic of LGBTQIA plus. So let's just kind of recap a little bit. You were on several weeks ago, and you talked about your journey and your exploration of coming or letting people into your life and how you identify, because if I remember correctly, you said you identify as pansexual, and I don't think we actually had anyone that identified as that on the show previously. So you open up a whole new world for the community, and I think a lot of people got a lot out of your original discussion and you just sharing who you are as an individual. Now, I know you're very big in politics and you're an advocate for the community. And, you had a very unique story coming from Jamaica, being from the Caribbean, and then also living here in the States for a couple of years. And you're actually in law school, getting ready to finish out your last semester. Is that correct?
That's right. Yep.
All right. So, we talked after the show, and, you had mentioned to me you wish you had a little bit more time to talk about a few more topics and just kind of delve deeper into some of the topics that we did discuss. So what I want to do is give you the opportunity to just kind of talk about some of the things you wanted to discuss. So the floor is yours, my friend.
Yeah. So where do we start? I think I probably just wanted to start with like how we show up like in the workplace. I think and I'll connect like my experiences to like the broader like discourse of like LGBT folks like in the workplace or workforce. I think for me, like there, like just as a Black person, like or many of us are very familiar with like code switching. Like how you show up in one space is different from how you show up in another space. And it's sort of like a survival mechanism, if you will. And I feel like the same way when it comes to being like a queer, like a pansexual person, like in the workplace. And so I just kind of wanted to like briefly touch on what that means to me and sort of like how to combat those like otherisms, like because you can sometimes feel like othered in the workplace, especially when they're like stay even with like anti-discrimination laws on the books, depending on where you're living, you can still be fired from your job because you're a part of like the queer community. You can still lose your housing, and you can still be denied access to healthcare. Fortunately for me, that hasn't been my experience because I lived in Minnesota previously, and Minnesota has been in the news a lot lately because the VP pick is from there, and it's a fairly progressive state. Um, but if you move like farther south or even to other states like in the Midwest, that might not be your experience. So for me, how I show up in the workplace is I honestly just try to be as genuine as possible. I don't necessarily talk about my sexuality unless it's like asked or someone asks me about it, in which case I am like open and I'm like honest about it.
Yeah.
But to like a certain degree, like while maintaining like a certain level of like professionalism because of like boundaries. I will say though, like because I've worked in many public facing roles. For example, I worked at a museum. That was my first job. When people show up and they see me how I am, it makes them feel more comfortable, more open, and I think that's probably one of the most like important things that you can do as a queer individual. It's not only to be comfortable in your own skin, because I think it's like a revolutionary act, because as I mentioned in the first interview, we live in a heteronormative society, and so if you're not heterosexual, you're likely going to be othered, even in progressive spaces, because there's a sort of like a social hierarchy of like what's a good gay versus a bad gay.
Yeah.
Um, and we see that even more. Like, I can't speak directly to this because I don't identify as trans, but even this, like, for trans individuals, like how they show up, like if they're presentable or not, that's also like a point of discourse, like in the workplace. So if you're someone who's very out, um, that can be a blessing and a curse, like in disguise, but it also can sometimes put a target on your back. That said, though, I still think folks should be, as old as possible. They should experience like pride in like who they are, because it can help someone, especially for like children as they are like coming up in the world and really wanting to look at what do healthy relationships look like. And healthy relationships don't necessarily have to be ones where like both individuals or multiple individuals are straight. And so I think it's both a learning opportunity for like our youth, um, to really kind of experience like different kinds of relationships. So when I was growing up, for example, we never discussed queer relationships. I don't think I met a single person who was openly queer when I was growing up. That especially if they're in a relationship, and it wasn't until I left the island I started to see more of that. And initially, it was sort of like a culture shock. So, for example, like something like public display of affections, if you're in a same-sex relationship, that is not something I would ever see in Jamaica. But when I moved to Minnesota, I saw that quite often, and people were much more like open about like who they were, and they
Yeah.
also leaned into it for advocacy purposes, and that's how I got involved um, with
Well,
doing that.
before you go any further, I want to kind of step back a little because you said something in regards to how you show up at work and how you identify. One of the things I've always found very frustrating is it shouldn't really matter um, who you are when it comes to your job because someone's not hiring you because you're pansexual, you're gay, you're queer, you're transgender. They are hiring you for your qualifications and if you can do the job. So your sexual identity should have nothing to do with the workplace and how you show up to do a job. And it's kind of odd that you said that because I realized, after I started letting people in, you know, fortunate enough for me, when that process started, it was during COVID and no one was going to an office. And I had actually
Right.
just gotten laid off from the job that I had. So that wasn't really ever an issue. But I did notice looking back at it, um, I didn't necessarily, allow people to see me in my fullness. But in fairness to me, I'm not there to show up as um, how I identify. I'm there to do a job, be paid for that job, and then leave. You know, so I find it very odd when people are discriminated against in the workplace because you're not hired because of your sexuality and or who you sleep with or who you have a relationship with. You are hired for a job, and if you're qualified enough to do that particular job. So I just kind of wanted to touch base on that a little bit because that always bothered me, and it still does. And the fact that people are discriminated against till this day because of their sexuality and who they love, it's
Mhm.
it's wrong, and we need to call people out on it.
Yeah, like I definitely can touch on that a bit more. You're absolutely right. Like your sexuality shouldn't have to do with anything when you're getting a job because you're hired for your qualifications. But unfortunately, that is not the world we live in. I think one example this would be like just to draw like a correlation. There was like a study I read about like a little while ago with folks who had like quote unquote like Black or African sounding names versus those who had just like regular like white names like Joe or Eric or something like that.
Or
And how,
Chris.
you know, and how like, like there's a clear difference in terms of who was hired and who was not, because one of the concepts that makes me very uncomfortable and I'm not sure how to deal with it yet is the whole idea of like a culture fit, because who gets to define what is a right fit for like their workplace culture, because people ultimately hire based on not only qualification but who they like, who they think is going to like add to the space that they're like all working in, not taking away from it, and ideally someone who's not as resistant, I think, because when you start putting up resistance in the workplace, bosses generally don't like that, because it can disrupt the flow of things. So I know, for example, with affirmative action on the chopping block, it has been since honestly like it came into existence. With affirmative action on the chopping block, many workplaces, instead of like explicitly naming like that they're encouraging like LGBTQ candidates or Black and brown folks to apply, or just diverse candidates generally, they have watered down like that language for legal reasons or the fear that they may get sued. Which I think is a backwards approach. So when I apply for jobs, for example, previously I used to be like explicit, like in my cover letters. By the way, I hate writing cover letters, but in my line of work, you have to write them because people actually read them. But generally, I want to say like most places they don't read a cover letter. It's just a formality. And so now, like, for me, it's sort of like a fine line, just kind of trying to find that balance of how do I tell my story in a cover letter while also highlighting my qualifications? Because I want to do more than just like regurgitate my resume. Because if you want to know what I've done, you can look at my resume. But if you want to know who I am, that's when you're going to want to read like the cover letter. So for me, it's in just trying to find that balance of like, how do I tell them my story that I'm like, Black and that I'm part of the community? Because on the applications, when you apply, there's a section where you fill that out for like the government, but it's not required. And I don't think employers can even use it in deciding whether to hire someone or not. So you have to like explicitly name it. So that's something I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that area. Um, I serve on the LGBT bar of New York, and several months ago we had, I believe it was like a CLE, or it might have just been like a webinar where we talked about like a lot of folks like in the legal field, if they're publicly out, once they start working professionally, they sort of are forced to like go back in the closet. Um, and some of that has to do with client expectations. Like clients might have certain views of the world, and because you're an agent of your client and a fiduciary of your client, you can't do anything really that like goes against your client to some degree. And so those are things I think are worth like considering that we need to address like on a policy level, and also deeper conversations on what it means to be inclusive, because an employer, a business, a workplace, they can all say we're inclusive, until the cows come home. But if you
Yeah.
don't feel included, then that's a different story. And I think many places they struggle with creating that sense of inclusion and welcomeness, like in the workplace, even on paper when they're like, we have all these awards for the best workplace to work.
Yeah. You know what? It's funny because you made mention of this a little bit earlier, and I think this is exactly what you're talking about, code switching. And for people that are in the community, they know exactly what code switching means. For those that are not in the community and don't understand what that terminology is, it's really about like we're just going to use a work environment as an example. You show up, say you show up in the world as more femme presenting in your regular everyday life. But when you go to work, you try to be that masculine um, individual to fit in with society's norms, and you know how to turn it on and off. And I think a lot of us do that, especially in the queer community. You do that code switching when you're around other people that aren't necessarily as accepting, and you want to fit in, or even better, you want to make them comfortable. Not
Yeah.
so much allowing yourself to be comfortable and to be your authentic self and show up as yourself every single time, but to be in a space with everyone, you make them feel comfortable. In order to do that, you diminish yourself. You diminish yourself in public spaces, and then also in the work environment. And I think we tend to do that a lot. And I think what you were just mentioning about being a fiduciary for your client and also representing your client, to a certain degree, that is code switching. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yes. So I think, like I said earlier, like, like I'm in my final year of law school. And so one of the classes we take is professional responsibility. And that class is all about like legal ethics. Um, and a big chunk of that class is sort of like, how do you work with clients? How do you treat clients? And so as an attorney, regardless of who your client is, the expectation is that you should treat your client like you would any other client, regardless of what their traits or qualities um, may be. So, like, you're in some ways, like, you're supposed to be neutral, but you're also not necessarily neutral because you're working to meet your client's ends. Um, so I'm gonna borrow a term from like legal scholar like Patricia Williams. She coined the term like spirit murdering, which was like she described it as like a form of like racial violence that like can rob people of color of their humanity, dignity, and inflict personal, psychological, and spiritual injuries. I think spirit murdering or spirit murder can also apply to queer people feeling like they're forced to go back in the closet when they enter the workforce, especially in states where you can still get fired for not being straight, or in some states, for example, like I'm wearing locks, like you get fired for the type of hairstyle you have. I mean, we just had a case out of Texas. A plaintiff's lost. I'm not sure if they'll appeal, but some of these things are sort of like they're just like innately a part of like who you are, so you can't separate like your identity from like your work or like the things that you're doing. And so those are things that I think certainly had to like grapple with in the workplace, and probably continue to have to wrestle with my entire career because the legal profession is still very conservative. I think we've made some strides like in the right direction in terms of being a little bit more progressive, but it's still very conservative. So for example, when you show up to court, you're expected, at least in my experience, I know when I did like mock trials last year, you're expected to be wearing a suit and a tie. Um, and some people may not like identify with the suit and tie like dynamic, or just like even with the formalities, but those are things they have to do because it's not so much about them, it's about how other people receive them. So like, how does a judge look at you? Like, you don't want to upstage your client, for example, and take the focus off of them. A good example would be if you've seen the movie My Cousin Vinny. I love that movie.
Yes.
The
It's a good
scene where
movie.
the judge chastised Vinny for what he was wearing. It's just like you can't show up in court looking like that or wearing that. That is an example I think of. It might Those experiences might be heightened for LGBTQ folks because I, for one, like I love color. Like I'm not much of a suit and tie guy or like black and grays. I like bright colors. But if I'm going to court or something, I might need to tone that down, um, so that it doesn't affect like a client or the judge's perception of who I am.
Right. So let me ask this question because you kind of mentioned something about how you're going to a profession that's a little bit more traditional, more toned down, and in today's society, I see that people are going against the norms. I look at like there's a congressman, I forget his name now. He's from Pennsylvania. He does not go in to Congress when he goes to do his votes or when he's on the floor in a suit and tie. He's in sweats or shorts and a hoodie. And that is definitely against the norm. But you're facing a couple negatives for yourself off the bat. You're black. One.
Mm-hmm.
Two, you have dreads. And then three, you belong to the queer community. So it's like, how do you show up for your client, but then also still show up for yourself while you're at work?
Right. How do I show up for my client and show up for myself? Well, I can. I don't have like a ton of client experience, but I can stay for this. Last summer, like last Friday, my internship ended. I did immigration work primarily for dairy farmers. And one of the things, the most important thing to me while working with those clients was ensuring that one, that they're comfortable, and that I'm meeting their needs as much as possible, especially if they're in crisis. But also while doing that, making sure I'm comfortable. And I think the way how I do that is because I display like a sort of sense of confidence that makes the client more comfortable. And sometimes it's just a matter of trying to figure out like who your client is. So if you know your client is someone who's not as open, who's not very conservative, you don't want to like deliberately try to step on their toes, because that can really fracture or mess like with the dynamic and ultimately like the outcomes that like the client may be looking for. So for me, like I I feel like I don't really code switch as much, because I just sort of like show up as who I am. I like the example of what you used of that person that's showing up in like sweats and stuff. I think it's a revolutionary act, honestly. Like because it kind of goes against the grain. It helps us to question why do we do things the way we are. Like for example, when I was growing up, it's funny now, like one of the things the elders used to say, like you might ask question, they'd be like, you ask too much question. You're like you're like, okay. But then you realize sometimes too, it's because they might respond, the adults might have responded to me or others in that way because they might not necessarily know the answers either. Like they've just been doing something for a long time and then it just became like this a thing that people did. And so when that one person shows up and it's like, why are we doing this the way we're doing it? Nobody really has an answer. And
Yeah.
so a response to that is to push back and say, well, why are you asking questions? This is all the way it's always been. But I refuse to believe or accept that some things are the way they've always been, because I think, as humans, we're supposed to change. Um, Things we used to do, we don't really do those things anymore. And as we grow, things are going to be changing. We shouldn't be stagnant and remain in the same place that we are. So as you can tell, I'm not much of a traditionalist.
Right. I remember the guy's name is Senator John Fetterman from the state of Pennsylvania. That's
Yes.
who it was. But here's the other thing. Now, here's the kicker. I don't believe he'd be able to get away with it if he was black or queer. He's a white man. So there's a certain level of privilege that's already built into it. And, of course, people kind of raise their eyebrows at it initially, but, he was able to get away with it. And he still does it till this day. Now, when I look back at, I'm going to use former President Obama. When
Obama.
he
That's
wore
what I
a tan
thought about.
suit, when he wore a tan suit, the world was ending. They could not believe that this man wore a tan suit in the Oval Office. How dare he? It was summertime, it was hot, and he was dressed appropriately, and it was a suit. You know what I mean? So I don't even know what to say if you were to try to show up as your authentic self in a courtroom, dressed non-traditionally.
Right.
So you don't want to ever take away from the seriousness of what you're there in court for, to defend a client. So I do get that to a certain degree, but then also I think that we all should be able to show up authentically and who we are.
I agree. I
Yeah.
think too, just in terms of like even just like the messages that we write, like written materials. When I was a first year law student, one of the things we learned I took this class called LCR, which is short for Legal Communication and Research. One of the things we learned was that when you're doing legal writing, repetition is key. And you also don't want to put too much emotion into what you're writing. You want to try to remain as objective as possible, which is something I struggle with because I feel like I wear my emotions on my sleeve. Like I'm a very passionate person. And when I write, that comes out in my writing. And so that was something I really had to struggle with in terms of like, how do I do more objective writing? And then like for mock trial, when you're in court, that's when you're like, oh, that's when you want to like play up on the emotions. But I also think too, like whenever I'm writing anything, whether that's a memo or a legal brief, behind that is a person. So it's not just a set of facts. There's an individual or individuals that you're talking about, and it's important to me to portray them as human. So for like I know like um, most of the cases I worked on this summer, they were called SIJ cases, which means special immigrant juvenile status, and it's one of the only ways, if not the only way, to be able to get legal status in the U.S. if you're a minor and you're undocumented. And there's three criteria for that. It has to be abandonment, neglect, or abuse, and that order has to come from a state court. So until a state court says that you fit this criteria, you're not able to then move into the federal process of then trying to get a work permit, a green card, and essentially becoming on your way to having legal status. So in those cases, it's important to highlight who this person is and why they should qualify for this particular status. So folks might be leaving their country because they're part of the LGBTQ community and they're real credible threats to their lives, or maybe their families abandoned them for that reason. I know in Jamaica, it's been a few years since I've lived there, so it may be different now. But at least when I was there, um, many LGBT folks, from the time they were like teenagers or even younger, were kicked out of their homes because their families wouldn't accept that they were gay or trans or queer. And then they would end up on the streets, and like essentially like living an underground lifestyle that some of it may involve crime so they could survive. There's a documentary I did see on YouTube once. I can't remember what it's called right now, but the documentary just talked about folks who formed that community like underground, and what it was like for them to be living through that day to day, not being able to find jobs or just showing up as they are, which in itself is a revolutionary act because you are choosing to show up as you are authentically despite threats to your life, which I think is just something that's like really amazing and incredible because it also encourages others to do the same and like really push against the grain.
Yeah. No, I love that you're doing that. If you happen to come across that film title, definitely share it with me, and I'll definitely put it in the description so people can actually go and check it
Yeah, I
out.
can actually look it up right now and tell you
Yeah.
stuff.
So I have a question for you. You're basically at the end of your law school education. This is your last semester. What are you looking to do once you graduate? Like, how do do you want to take this degree and continue doing what you've been doing this past year as far as like internship, or are you going to be doing something in law specific to LGBTQIA plus
Mhm.
rights?
Yeah, so I'm gonna give you both a long and a short answer for that. So the short answer is I'm always an advocate, so I'll definitely continue to try and find ways to advocate, regardless of if I'm practicing law or not. So far, my advocacy has looked like helping to get LGBTQ candidates elected to office because I serve on a political action committee. So we help to fundraise, we endorse candidates, we phone call, we door knock, we do all those things to help people get elected to office because I think that's important. So in Minnesota, for example, where I live, we had the first like openly trans like legislator elected to office. And because their presence in the legislature, I think, is revolutionary because it's never happened before, and because of their experiences, they're able to really speak to the realities of what trans folks in Minnesota are experiencing. Um, that's one way I do advocacy. I recently was appointed to the LGBTQ committee on the New York City Bar. And so New York City Bar, I'm hoping to think of it as a home in many ways where I will learn a lot and meet a lot of people in terms of like how can we use like these legal institutions as a vanguard for like change in the legal profession because the legal community in some ways is very small. It doesn't feel like that at times, but it is, and it's something they stress a lot when you're in high school. Like your peers are going to be your employers. You know, someone might call and ask like, who are you like in law school? You know, that sort of thing. Um, so career wise, I'm hoping to do labor and employment work for very specific reasons. I think everyone is a worker at some point in their lives. So it's something that there'll always be a need for. Um, my own mom, you know, she's had like her adverse experiences with employers like throughout her life. Um, and multinational employers specifically where like for example they would lay off workers for wanting better working conditions, and so for me that instilled in me like a really strong sense of justice. I'm a huge believer in, you know, how unions can like elevate like your economic status. um, I'm also a huge believer from the time I was a young person. I'm still a young person technically, but discussing how in the having like young people at every decision making table, um, because I think it's important to have folks who are not typically represented in the mainstream discourse to be at those tables because otherwise other folks are speaking for us who may not have those direct experiences, and they could be allies, which is not a bad thing, but allies can never really speak to our experiences in the way that we can. um, so all that to say, I think I'm gonna continue to do advocacy work. What that advocacy work looks like may change, it may differ. For right now, like I'd like to start doing some of that work in the legal field. um, I think pipeline programs are important. So the Victory Fund, for example, if you're interested in electoral work, they do a lot of work in terms of like highlighting LGBTQ folks for office and supporting them. There are LGBT bars across the nation. Those are good places to tap into. Um, Something I want to highlight in this upcoming Supreme Court term, just like last term, where they ruled on like, you know, essentially criminalizing homelessness. Um, there's
Right.
it's coming up to address like trans people, like around issues of like identity, like bathrooms and access to healthcare, you know, those sort of things. So those are things I think, even if you're not a part of the community, you should be paying attention and trying to find ways to advocate for the better, because I'm a believer if it's that one of us is not doing well, then none of us are doing well, because we're all
Absolutely.
connected.
The other thing too that I think you touched upon, even if you're not a part of the community or even if you're not an ally, I think you need to be very cognizant because you might not be, but someone is a part of that community. And
Exactly.
I totally agree with you when you say, you know, that if you're not an ally, and if you're part of the problem, and we don't want to have that. The whole thing about bathrooms being an issue over the last several years, like that just seems so frivolous to me. Um, we need more people like you. We need more advocates that are out there on the forefront that are pushing for LGBTQIA plus rights, trans rights. I know you had mentioned the last time we kind of ended on the first episode that you were even looking into maybe being more political down the road. Talk about that. Like, what are your some ambitions in the future?
Yes, thank you. Well, I always said that I wouldn't run for office because based on my professional experiences, I feel you can be more effective behind the scenes, and that's just the nature of our political system. Like unlimited money in elections. We've seen that, with the recent races with the squad. Representative Cory Bush and Jamal from New York, just sort of like how money got injected into that process to ultimately like oust them. And I believe that they're great advocates for the community on a number of issues like homelessness, for example. We know that homelessness disproportionately impacts LGBTQ folks, access to healthcare. And so even if folks aren't part of the community, they're speaking to those issues directly. I think it moves the needle forward because then you can look at it from a sense of like intersectionality, from a point of view of being intersectional. As far as my political aspirations go, I'm currently in New York. I haven't like said this publicly to anyone, but I think my tune has changed a bit where now I'm like, I think I want to run for office because I think that's where I'll be able to have the most influence combining legal and political. And my hope whenever I do run for office and ultimately win, because I like to win, um, my hope is that every policy I support, every policy I advocate for, will be doing so from an intersectional point of view. So to kind of like sidetrack a little bit, I didn't talk about this much in the beginning, but I think as a Black person who's also queer, my experiences and the experience of many other people, it's unique in the sense that Black people, like many of us, we know what it's like to experience racism, but to experience like LGBTQ discrimination, it's a different sort of story because there's this sort of like hierarchy of like hypermasculinity like in the Black community. And so like, men aren't supposed to cry, like you're supposed to be, like a womanizer, you're supposed to be all these other things. And so like when you're queer, you're sort of, because of the way your identities intersect, is sort of like one piece of your identity is ultimately cutting against you in some ways because you could be even if you're a straight man but you appear feminine or effeminate, like at the root of all that, I don't think it's necessarily homophobia, but I think it's really misogynoir, like misogyny, where it's not so much the fact that someone is gay or queer, it's more about the fact that like they remind it reminds folks of like feminine features or being like a woman, and that goes against like the whole idea of being like hyper masculine or masculine or being like the provider in the community. And so I think that's also an issue as a community, but also as allies, we really need to address on a deeper level is misogyny, because it really is one of those things where violence can come from that because you're not, it's violence against yourself, but also violence against others. Um, so I don't know. I think I'm trying to think of a specific policy I can give you that would help. I think probably one of the first things I want to address, if it's not already addressed, is really making anti-discrimination laws stronger and explicitly naming sexual identity as a protected class.
Well, let me ask you this. A lot of times we will pass these measures, or governments will pass these measures, but until it becomes a part of, it becomes an amendment and is actually in the Constitution,
Mm.
all these things that we're doing can be overturned. I mean, just look at Roe versus Wade, and um, look at the Right to Marry Act. If God forbid the Republicans are to win the White House and Congress again in the fall, me as a married queer individual can see those my rights being completely wiped away, because it's not an amendment. These are just laws that are on the books. So I hear what you're saying, and I truly believe that you can be one of those people that will be able to make change, and we need more people like you.
Oh, thank you.
um, yeah. So as we start to wrap this up, is there anything else you would like to add to this conversation?
Yeah, I'm just trying to like address your point just now about what feeling like these things can be overturned depending on the makeup of the Congress or the administration. And I often think about that. I think it was Oprah who said it, like something along the lines of all my life I had to fight. We have to keep fighting.
Yeah.
Asada Shakur, Harriet Tubman, all our ancestors before us, they knew what it meant to have to keep fighting. And so I think that's something that we need to actively remind ourselves of, is that for every win we get, there are 10 other people behind us trying to overturn that win. Um, and progressive wins, at least in my experience that I've seen, they don't seem to last very long before, because, and part of the reason for that is because there's a level of organization on like the far right or even in the center, um, that they continue to like their real powers ideas. So like a culture wars, for example, I think it's manufactured rage. um, but it speaks to people, like it speaks to like the darkest parts of people, where they're like, oh, like it's sort of like this whole idea of rights as we know it. It's it's like a pie, sort of. That's how people think of it, where like you're taking out, if one group gets more, quote unquote, more rights, that means that another group is losing rights. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. There's enough for everyone. And I think that sometimes we need to find like allyship in even unlikely places and really find those opportunities to connect with people. So I'm a huge believer in relational organizing. Start with your family. I know with me being queer, just being queer alone in my family, I'm not the only queer person in my family, but it sort of causes your family to like to think about things a little bit differently.
Yes.
Especially if there are folks who are anti-gay, or like held like anti, like, or held homophobic like sentiments. It helps them to really question like why this is happening to them, for lack of better words.
Yeah.
uh, and then outside of your family, like thinking about like your friends and talking about this shit, because it's just like you said, even if you are homophobic or something, there's at least one person in your circle that is gay or queer. You might not know that, but they certainly are listening and paying attention to how you're reacting, because they know that that ultimately plays into things like suicide rates, for example. People need safe spaces, and if they don't feel safe, they might not feel like they have a right to exist. And yeah, there's a lot more I could say, but I am really grateful we had this conversation. It's something that should be ongoing. Certainly in the workplace, is really addressing like how to, make your workplaces more inclusive. And also in education too, because that's where I think a lot of like our understanding of LGBTQ rights starts with education. So if you're a teacher, um, choose materials that are like diverse, that show multiple perspectives. Make it known that you're someone who's safe and comfortable to discuss, to talk to, because those small things can make a big difference. And I don't think we talk about that enough. So that's all I have to say for now. But this is a really great conversation. I'm so happy we got to do this, and I'm excited to see the work you continue to do, and also work what I'm going to be doing. I'm excited to see where I end up.
I'm super excited. Thank you for sharing this safe space with me and this audience. This was such a beautiful and insightful conversation. I could sit there and listen to you for hours. I know that the people that will watch this will walk away feeling empowered and just getting so much from this conversation. I'm so glad that you reached out to me and said you want to come back and you want to just have a little bit more discussion about it and just kind of talk about some of the other things we talked about, especially workplace environment. So important. DeAndre, thank you so much. And guys, thank you guys for joining us for another great episode of Safe Space. As I always say to you guys, take care of yourselves, take care of others, and maintain a safe space. I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching this show on Indecent Media. Now, if you're watching here on YouTube, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification button so that you can get notified when we drop new videos every week. See you guys next time.